My name is Ken Levinson. I'm the Executive Director of WITA. We are delighted to have so many here today on this very wet Washington Tuesday. This really is a terrific event we're looking forward to hosting right now. We have two great panels and a speaker from the administration that we're pleased to host. I'll introduce momentarily. A few quick WITA notes. Next event that we'll be dealing with the new or renewed negotiations of the U.S.-EU Trade and Regulatory Agreement. I'm not sure if it has a name yet, so we're not going to call it anything. Also want to bring to your attention a very special event that we're going to be talking more about in the weeks to come. We're going to be hosting in January our first ever Washington International Trade Conference. This will be an all-day event with plenaries and breakout sessions. It'll be here at the Reagan Building. It'll be Tuesday, January 29th. It'll be ending with a reception in the atrium where we host our annual dinner. We hope all of you will consider attending. There's these pink sheets that you can find in the back. They have information on the conference on our website as well. We're still talking about what are the breakout sessions. We're giving a sample list of some of the things we might talk about. We hope also if you are of an organization that wants to have exposure with the trade community that you might consider sponsoring that event. We also have a FDA Registrar Boot Camp, which is another half-day session looking at FDA regulations, something we've done every year for the past few years with a company called Registrar Corp. That's coming up in early November, so take a look for that. With that, I want to begin our event today by introducing Heath Tarbert, Dr. Heath Tarbert, who is the Assistant Secretary of Treasury for International Markets and Investment. He was sworn in almost exactly a year ago. He was a former partner at the firm of Allen & Overy. Previously worked for the Senate Banking Committee. He worked for President George W. Bush as well, and as a clerk to the U.S. District Court of Appeals and the U.S. Supreme Court. After Heath makes his remarks, he'll sit down for a short discussion with Dave Marchick, and then we will turn to our panel discussions. Heath?
Thank you very much, Ken, and thank you all for being here today. WITA does a great job of bringing people together to discuss important issues of international trade. So the topics that you're going to be hearing about today are no doubt some of the most important topics on the trade and international economic agenda. So I'm pleased to be here. Among other things, so I'm the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, and I'm in the International Division. One of my core responsibilities is overseeing the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, known as CFIUS. And today I was asked to just briefly describe for you sort of the new changes to that regime brought about by the Foreign Investment Risk Modernization Act, which we call FIRMA for short. It was signed by the President just last month in August, and I think many people have said that it is the single most bipartisan victory legislatively of the administration. So first, let me just talk about a quick refresher of why this legislation was needed. So CFIUS, of course, was established first in about 1975 to look at foreign investments in the United States, and then in 1988 there was a law that sort of crystallized that. But a few years ago, we started seeing dramatic changes in the foreign investment landscape that we hadn't seen throughout CFIUS's 40-year history. And nowhere were those changes more borne out than in our actual caseload. Two things. First, the volume of cases increased substantially. We went from something like fewer than 100 cases back in 2009, 2010 to a little under 240 last year. And this year we're on pace to hit or exceed that number. So we've seen 2 to 3 times the amount of cases that we had historically. Secondly, at the same time, the cases have been far more complex. Back 20, 30 years ago, when CFIUS cases were going through, the typical CFIUS cases you would see would be cases involving the defense community, aerospace, products and services that directly supported the defense establishment, contractors and whatnot. or companies that produce goods that were subject to ITAR or export controls, a subject you guys are going to talk about in a little bit. Well, all of those cases we still see today, but what we're seeing now are, for example, foreign governments using investments to meet strategic objectives. We're seeing complex transaction structures, not the typical merger and acquisition of the 1980s, for example. We're seeing increasingly globalized supply chains. And we're seeing the continued evolution of commercial activity with defense activity. So, to put it mildly, when a Silicon Valley company may actually pose a tangible national security threat in a similar manner to a traditional defense contractor, just because the application of the kinds of technologies they're working on could have potential national security implications. So we've seen a tremendous amount of change, and this has all made not only more cases, but those cases far more complex. It became pretty clear that modernizing CFIUS then should be a top priority of the administration. And so FIRMA, in many ways, it does essentially two big things. Number one, it strengthens CFIUS. And number two, it modernizes the process. Because we've always valued an open investment environment. So while we want to look at more types of transactions to see whether they give rise to national security concerns, we don't want to diminish the amount of foreign investment in the United States. And so that's why FIRMA has those two goals. In strengthening FIRMA, it really expands CFIUS's authority to cover some new types of transactions. And although many of you are familiar with the FINSA legislation, which was put in place after the Dubai ports controversy, in many ways what that legislation did was effectively work on the procedures of CFIUS to make it more accountable, to ensure that it's a rigorous process. What it did not do was enlarge the fundamental jurisdiction of CFIUS, which has remained the same for 30 years. So for the first time, FIRMA starts to bring in other types of investments. What are those kinds of investments? Well, first of all, real estate, and also leases and other concessions to maritime ports, to airports, and then also the purchase of land in close proximity to nationally security sensitive sites. So we had an odd situation, for example, a year or two ago, where we would see a purchase of a windmill on a property next to a military base. We could review that because it was the purchase of a business, but if they bought that land next to the military base, CFIUS couldn't review it. So it became clear that there was a gap there. And then the other big area were investments in certain types of companies where the level of investment didn't necessarily need to meet the control threshold to pose national security concerns. So for example, companies that have critical technologies, companies that are involved with critical infrastructure, and companies that have sensitive personal data that could give rise to a national security concern. These are all companies where even a single board seat, for example, could be enough to pose a national security concern. And so we've effectively lowered the control threshold for those types, for companies giving rise to those types of things. At the same time, we've modernized the process to make it easier, to make it more streamlined in some ways, and to make it more expedient for welcoming the kind of foreign investment that we want. So for example, for the first time now, we will have declarations, which is effectively going to be something akin to a 5-page form for repeat investors, for investors where there's clearly there's not a national security concern on the face. So rather than having foreign investors file that whole somewhere between 30 and 300 pages of a notice, they can file something very simply, and within 30 days we have to act on that. In some cases, we may require them to do the notice, but in other cases, we can simply approve the transaction on the basis of that short form filing. We've also changed the timing a little bit. The initial review phase, we've moved it from 30 days to 45 days. The goal there is to make sure the intelligence community as well as the committee has the time that they need to get things done. And then we can clear more transactions in 45 days rather than have them spill over into the longer process, which is triggered after the 30 days to expire. The other thing FIRMA gives us is special hiring authority, so we can go out and recruit the best and the brightest. We also have filing fees, so we can help ensure that CFIUS is well funded. There are a number of other things that FIRMA does. I'll stop there because we don't have time, but the bottom line is we have 18 months from last month to create regulations to implement it. We're moving at all deliberative speed to get FIRMA implemented to not only ensure that we protect our national security, but that we continue to welcome foreign investment in the U.S. So with that, I will close out my remarks. I think Dave will ask me a few questions, and then we'll probably open it up.
Thank you, Heath. If you guys can take a seat down here, really appreciate your remarks. Dave Marchick, old friend, thank you for joining us today. Dave and I met working on a investment-related project back in 14 years ago, CNOOC.
CNOOC, right.
Remember that? Yeah. That was the Chinese investment with Chevron.
Exactly.
Trying to buy Unical.
Right.
That's right. And that's where we met working on that project. And we're delighted to have you join us. Dave's with the Carlyle Group now. And is going to do a discussion with Heath. We'll take a few questions from the audience and then turn to our panelists.
Administration, there are one or two officials who truly demonstrate that they are punching above their weight. One of the most talented, highly effective people, and Heath is one of those people that I've seen in this administration, so thank you for your service. Let's start with the reg. We're going to do rapid fire questions. Let's start with the regs. You said you have 18 months to implement them, but you obviously have concerns as emblematic of the FIRMA legislation. So you're going to pursue some pilot projects in the regs, and what would that do?
It's possible. So one of the things that, in constructing the statute, working with Congress, we had sort of two things in mind. First, we had clear national security threats that we wanted to have some ability to act upon immediately. At the same time, this is a very complex piece of legislation, probably far more complex than even the FINSA statute. So we wanted to take the time to have the notice and comment rulemaking process to be able to ensure that we get it right. The compromise in sort of threading that needle was to have authority that allows us to do pilot programs. And the pilot programs expire at the 18 months that coincide with the rulemaking. So right now we are in the process of considering whether and how to use that pilot authority. We haven't made any final decisions as to what we're going to do there, but it's something that I think we're seriously considering acting on, but the goal of it would be to look out and look at those types of transactions that are sort of the most pressing in terms of potential national
So the big shift in FINSA was moving from covering control transactions, letting passive transactions go through, and now you have the authority to cover non-controlling, non-passive.
That's right.
And is that potentially the area where pilot programs would be put in place?
That's the sort of thing that we're looking at.
Okay. So you mentioned in your presentation that the United States has long had this open investment policy. It's been a policy since really the Reagan administration where we welcome foreign investment. But this entire process was really about Chinese investment in the United States, or that's what drove it politically on the Hill at least. So does the administration have a position on whether we welcome Chinese investment in the United States at this point?
Yes, so going back, I think you're right that many members of Congress in particular sort of viewed Chinese investment as the impetus for FIRMA. My own view was that I came in and I looked at this regime and it was effectively 30 years old in relevant respects and needed to be updated. And by the way, Dave was very kind to talk to me about, or to say nice things about me. I had a chance to say nice things about him. He has written the definitive book on investment security and history. So one of the things he mentioned...
The tagline for the book is better than Ambien.
No, it's excellent. But one of the things that I think is illustrated, which goes back to your question, is every 10 years we see different threats changing. In 1980s, we were talking about the Japanese. And 10 years ago, we were worried about investments from the Middle East because it was a little after it was a few years after 9/11. And so my thought on this was, look, we're not going to look at any particular country. We're going to build an investment regime that lasts for the 21st century. So that was my goal here. As far as investments from any particular country, we've always had an open investment policy, which means we welcome investment from any country around the world unless a specific investment gives rise to national security concerns. So that remains our position.
Okay, so you said that we have 240, 250 cases last year. How many cases do you anticipate under the new legislation?
We're still working that out because that will depend upon, in many ways, what the final regulations say. So obviously, we're trying, one of the things we're going to be working on is figuring out the universe of types of transactions that are most likely to give rise to national security concerns, making sure we capture those, but not extending it so far that we're looking at thousands of transactions that have nothing to do with national security. So we're trying to get it as tight as
250
possible.
today, do you think it'll be closer to like 260 or maybe 500, 1,000? Do you have any sense of?
I think it's going to be more than 260,
Okay.
all things being equal. And so how much more than that, we don't really know. But we're part of that will depend on the market and what kind of investments we see too. A lot of this depends not only on what the regulations will say, but also on the investment environment. We'll also be including real estate transactions.
Okay. So the legislation evolved quite a bit when it went through Congress. What were the biggest changes that you were happy about from the original bill to the final bill?
Yeah, so I think one of the things we've always tried to do with CFIUS legislation, even going back to Exxon Florio, was sort of strike that right balance between ensuring that we've got innovation and foreign investment in the U.S., but at the same time having a mechanism to address national security concerns. So one of the things that we had to grapple with, and you and many of you in this room were really helpful, was the offshore JP issue. And this was the problem that we saw, where we saw people to sort of get around CFIUS, for example, or simply as a matter of commercial practice, were pulling out critical technology, sticking it in an offshore JV, and as a result, it was no longer a foreign investment in the United States. We had to address that problem. There were a couple of different ways we could address it. We could address it by actually reviewing the constitution of the JV, or we could review it using sort of dialed-up export controls. And so what we decided was to create a new chapter that ultimately ended up in the Export Controls Bill, which has a process of defining critical technology and has a licensing regime. So that's one way to get at the offshore JV problem. And then we also have existing authority that if you were to take an actual business, a whole business, and put that in an offshore JV, we've always considered that to be the foreign acquisition of a U.S. business. So I'd say that change there was important, and it was something that I think was a watershed event in getting the business community on board.
Because many businesses were very concerned about the original JV provision, because it would have covered thousands and thousands of existing businesses.
Well, and it may not have been, in some ways it would have been effective, but in other ways this is far more effective because this allows transfers of technology. If it were just to focus on the establishment of the JV itself, that's one point in time. But if it focuses on critical technology being put offshore, being exported effectively, that has a continual process.
So you were in the middle of negotiating with Congress, but at the same time, you were in the middle of developing an administration view among incredibly divergent views from the Defense Department to the Homeland Security Department to the Treasury Department or USTR, which traditionally are more open investment. Which was more difficult, negotiating internally or negotiating with Congress?
That's a great question. Well, let me
He's not going to
put it this
answer
way.
it.
I consider myself enriched by having those unique experiences. What I can say is that getting it through 11 members of CFIUS, as well as other administration components, then working with the Senate, and then working with the House, and having the House and the Senate also work together. It was a long process. It required a lot of time and effort, but I think at the end of the day, that's why we got a piece of legislation that passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. I think it's better because of it.
Okay. Good non-answer. You all can speculate which was more difficult. Probably inside. But anyway. One of the other concerns with the operation of CFIUS is the treatment of non-controversial transactions. These are repeat investments from the same companies that are very acquisitive, or acquisitions from the UK, Canada, acquisitions that don't raise any national security concerns. But because the process has been bogged down, they've taken a long time. And I think you testified that 70% of the filings 2 years ago went to second phase investigation, which is, in my view, too many. So in your view, what's the ideal speed with which you can process non-controversial transactions?
Well, I think two things. So one is we can, if they file a declaration, then if there's no national security concerns, and that's very clear based on the information they provide, And that's two parts, right? So when we do a CFIUS transaction, we look at the threat plus the vulnerability equals the consequence. If we know the acquirer, and they're, let's say, a public sector pension fund that has done 30 CFIUS cases, we know who they are, and when then the vulnerability, we look at the target company, it's very clear there's no national security concerns. We should be able to clear that within 30 days on the declaration. But if a declaration isn't appropriate for whatever reason and we need more information, our goal would be to clear it in the review phase, the 45-day review phase.
So there will be a big priority in trying to move those non-controversial transactions through the process quickly.
I think for non-controversial transactions where there's no national security concerns, we obviously want to process those as quickly as we can.
Okay, I'm going to open up to the audience for a couple questions, see what Ken says on timing.
We've got about 5 minutes, so what we'll do is we'll take a couple questions and then take it back. So, who's got questions? You answered all of them. Okay, we got one in the back. And if we have one more, raise your hand while she's asking.
Hi, thanks for taking questions. I wanted to ask, there is some pushback on the Hill. Some House representatives have sent letters to Treasury, and it looks like what they're looking for is a little bit of flexibility within the regulations. Some critics of those types of letters are saying that it looks like they want looser regulations. I wanted to know what you made of that and how that's factoring into the rulemaking and the process of coming up with the
Can you please identify yourself?
Saleya with Bloomberg News.
Any other questions, or is that our one more over here, and then we'll be done? Please identify yourself.
Hi, David Lauder with Reuters News Service in Washington. I was just wondering if you have noticed or if you've seen any evidence since this bill has passed, is there any kind of a deterrent effect that has occurred with transactions? Are you seeing maybe transactions that wouldn't have taken place, that would have taken place before, but maybe people are more cautious about going forward with them? Thanks.
Any other ones, or I'll address them?
These are confidential except for the news sources in the room.
Yeah, so I'll take the Bloomberg question first. I think there we are focused on, Congress has spoken to the issue through passing the legislation. So we're focused on the text of the legislation and what it means. At the same time, we're going to continue to obviously talk to key stakeholders. We will do that through the notice and comment process, both to the community, the business community development stakeholders, and my goal is also to have a continuing dialogue with the congressional committees, just to let them know what we're up to, since they played such an important role in helping to establish the legislation. As far as whether it has had a deterrent effect, I see no evidence of that. It's hard to prove the negative, as it were, that there's transactions that would have taken place that aren't taking place, but I can tell you that in the transaction queue, even new filings, we're seeing transactions that one would think that maybe the FIRMA legislation could cause them to consider, but I think it's a minor. I don't think that I'm seeing no evidence that there's any kind of deterrent effect. Yes, sir.
Oh, I guess we have. Yeah. Dana, can you project your voice?
I'll try. It's Dana Marshall, Transnational Strategy Group. I wonder if you could discuss at all the impact of FIRMA and all that you're thinking about with respect to M&A transactions involving parties outside of the United States that could have an effect here. Could you describe that a bit?
Yeah, it's something I didn't mention in my remarks, but it's worth highlighting. One of the things that, as we were thinking through how do we create an investment security regime for the 21st century, was confronting the idea that, well, it may very well be that we have a transaction that poses a national security risk in the United States, but we could also have transactions totally abroad that also pose a national security threat, not only to those countries, but also to the United States. If there's a piece of absolute critical technology, and that critical technology is produced in Silicon Valley, but it's also produced in Europe or somewhere else, and if we have one of our strategic competitors, let's say, getting hold of that critical technology that would pose a national security concern, then it doesn't matter really where they get it, as long as they get it. And so we work to try to help other countries create similar regimes. And one of the things that FIRMA gives us is the ability to work more closely with our allies to share information as to specific transactions that may have component parts in both the United States and abroad. So and you see this there are several embassies represented in the room, and many of you are right now working on your own investment security regimes, and we are trying to provide whatever technical advice we can. So it is definitely something that is a big development.
With that, Keith, thank you. We are not taking a formal break, and I'll give a big round of applause for Heath Carver.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here.
We are not taking a